Good day. I'd like to welcome you to our Bible class today at North MacArthur. As we are reading through the Old Testament, then we have looked at the life of Solomon, and today we're going to look at the Book of Song of Solomon, and I'll mention some things about that in just a second. But for the members at North MacArthur, we got a phone call from Brother Bill, and Chuck Phelps has been able to go home, so we want to keep he and his family in our prayers and pray for his recovery. And that's good news that he's been able to go home. What's so interesting about the Song of Solomon is that it has probably suffered either from overuse and abuse on one hand and virtual neglect on the other. I just chuckled when I read this. This is something from David Bland. He said, by the year 1200, over 100 commentaries had been written on the Book of Song of Solomon. And there hasn't been that many written since, I can tell you. But what is very interesting about this, like, for example, Origen, who's going to live in Alexandria, Egypt, and when I hear the word Alexandria, I always think of allegory. And for the people who wanted to have an allegory, especially between Christ and the church, then he wrote 10 volumes of commentaries just on the Book of Song of Solomon. Between 1135 and 1153, a man by the name of Bernard of Clairvaux, he preached from the first two chapters of Song of Solomon's, and I don't know if he planned to go all the way through, but he had preached 86 sermons from the first two chapters of Song of Solomon. Kind of wears you out. But for people who believe in an allegorical interpretation, then this has been a book that has been, I would say, both used and abused in that regard. And we'll talk about that in just a second. I'm in a class with Thomas Warren when he is preparing to debate Anthony Flew. And this wasn't the subject of the class, but he said something that's always stuck with me. And he just said, every book of the Bible is perfect for the reason that God gave it. And I think one of our challenges as teachers, preachers, parents, grandparents, is we always need to be looking and aware for, well, what was the reason that God gave that book? What was the reason that it was inspired by the Holy Spirit? And so through the years, I've given, I think, either 2 or 3 weddings where the primary text for the wedding was from the Book of Song of Solomon. There would be obviously some parts you would leave out, but there's a lot said about devotion, commitment, and fidelity, as we're going to look at. And I have done a marriage retreat where we're away from a Friday night and Saturday, just from the Book of Song of Solomon. And what I'd like to propose to you is that from the very beginning, and we're going to mention this here in just a second, but from the very beginning, the only thing that is not good, and you keep hearing each day of creation, now that's good, now that's good, and that's good. The only thing that's not good is Adam, man, by himself. And as I have said, ladies, you are the completion of creation, and it was finally when Eve is created that everything is very good. And it only makes sense to me that somewhere in the wisdom literature that first relationship that God created, God established, then there would be some sense of commentary on that, and it's going to be from a very poetical section of the Old Testament, and we call it Song of Solomon. When you look at the Jewish people historically, and I just want to give these by way of background, the Jewish people historically have read this as God's love for Israel. And again, a very kind of allegorical interpretation of the book. The problem that I have both with God's love for Israel and then the later Christian version of Christ's love for the church is that the very opening of it says, "Oh, that you would kiss me with the kisses of your mouth. Your love is better than wine." And it seems like we miss a little bit of context when we primarily look at a book and say, that reminds me of God's love for Israel. But that has been one of the ways that has been interpreted, especially in Jewish thought, for a long period of time. When you look at the Christians, and I want you just to kind of go through those early centuries, the persecution of the Christians from the time of Nero into Domitian in the first century, severe persecution off and on in the second century, and then the very beginning of the third century, there was very intense persecution. And then Constantine comes along, and in 311 AD, he gives the Edict of Toleration. We're going to tolerate Christians. And then he gives the Edict of Milan in 313, and now Christianity becomes the legal religion of the Roman Empire. And a part of what had kept Christianity so vibrant was the persecution. You didn't have people come to church just because people would recognize them and, hey, this is a great thing to do. Christians were being killed. But after Christianity became legal, a part of the church became, and I'm going to use the word monastic. And what I mean by monastic is people would go off and live in the desert, or they would live in isolated places. And not only did monasticism become very important, but so did celibacy. And it was a higher level of spirituality not to be married, not to have a wife. And so as you go into the mid-300s, all the way toward the Middle Ages, then it doesn't surprise me then that Christians are going to come along and interpret this book primarily from the point of view of Christ's love for the church. And I just want to mention this. I think we should all treat poetry different than we do narrative or text. And what I mean by that is that poetry should have the ability to engage our senses. It should have the ability to use figures of speech and those types of things. And in our hymn book, we have at least 3 songs that have been sung in our generation that reflect a point of view that says, oh, here is something from the Song of Solomon, and this is either about Christ or about his people. For example, I have found a friend in Jesus, he's everything to me. He's the what? He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul, the lily of the valley. And so when you go back and read in Song of Solomon chapter 2 and verse 1, the writers will say in the book of Song of Solomon, not Jesus, the writers will say, I am a rose of Sharon, I am a lily of the valley. Jesus, rose of Sharon. We have another song that the whole point of view is taking a symbol and a figure from the book of Song of Solomon and attributing that to Jesus. I don't think that's what the book was written about, but I also don't have any problem singing the songs because I think poetic language should have that ability to express those things. However, historically in the past, there have been people who primarily see Song of Solomon as Christ's love for the church. A later song that isn't in some of our hymn books, but a lot of young people have sang, he invites me into his banquet table and his banner over us is love. And you get to looking, where does that come from? Song of Solomon. And so even in our hymnology, we have echoes of this book used in an allegorical way. And like I said, I don't have trouble singing those because I'm glad for poetry to have that kind of expression. When you look at just the whole concept of poetry, I think of things that are imaginative, things that are creative. And we're going to look at, and I just give you some samples here. I compare you, my love. My beloved is to me. My beloved is like a gazelle. My beloved is like a scarlet thread. And you're going to find the word like as a comparison 33 times in 8 chapters. And over and again, the writer's going to choose poetical figures of speech and things that are available to him to describe that. And I think when we look at these, we do these in speech all the time. Oh, it was wintertime, and when it rained, he climbed into bed and felt as snug as a bug in a rug. We do that all the time. And it very especially comes through in poetry. The beggar on the road looked as blind as a bat. And we use as and like, and we use those comparisons over and over. And this is something that's very significant when you come to poetry, because it is not intended to be literal. And as we said previously, when you read Hebrew poetry, read line A, and line B, the second line will always interact with that in some way or another. I think what this book is about is that it's poetry celebrating, and we're going to actually use the word covenant, the covenant love and the commitment that God intends between a man and a woman. I want to do one other thing for background, and just to throw this in. As the centuries went by, there were 5 books called the 5 Rolls, R-O-L-L-S. And these books were read at various feasts. And let me just give you these really quickly, but just think about this. During the feast of Passover, Song of Solomon was read. During the feast of Pentecost, the book of Ruth was read. After Jerusalem is destroyed, the 9th of Ab, which is the 9th of August, the book of Lamentations would be read. And then when you'd come into October, the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, then the reading would be from Ecclesiastes. And then when you come around into March, then the Feast of Purim, which is mentioned in Esther, then the book of Esther is read. And you look at these, and all of these but one make sense to me. I understand why you would read Ruth during Pentecost. That makes perfect sense. It's harder for me to understand why you would read Song of Solomon during the Passover, and I will have a suggestion before we close today. And especially if people are looking at this as an allegory of God's love and his people, you can see why some would choose to do that. One of the things we've talked about earlier is that Walter Kaiser has this wonderful comment that you read through the books of poetry and they commend in poetical language what the law commands. And we are first introduced to Adam in the Garden of Eden. God has created him, and he's living in an absolute paradise. And the only thing, as we've said, that is not good in all of that original creation is Adam by himself. So there's 2 chapters I just want to read a little bit from, and I want again to think of parentheses. The first one's going to be from Genesis 2, and then the second one is going to be, of all things, from Malachi 2. Now, if you had a Hebrew Bible, your Hebrew Bible would end with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. In our Bibles, and this has been set up in the English-speaking world for a long time, then we finish with the Book of Malachi, which is probably one of the last ones that are written. And I just read this and I think, how interesting. In the 2nd chapter of the 1st book and in the 2nd chapter of the last book, notice the things that are said. The Lord God said, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper for him." And the rib from which the Lord had taken from the man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. And the man said, "This is at last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man leaves his father and mother, cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and the woman were both naked and were not ashamed." I don't want to go into this in great detail, but it's very clear that God's design from the very beginning is in a marriage relationship. It would be between a man and a woman. And a few years ago, someone looked at me and they said, "That's very obvious." There's a lot of people who don't believe that today. But the very first example that we have created by God is the man and the woman, And those terms are going to be very significant. Leave, cleave, and become one flesh are going to be a part of God's standard for marriage for the rest of the Bible. But there's some interesting parallels between Genesis 2 and the environment of Song of Solomon. Genesis 2 is in the Garden of Eden, and I just find this interesting. There were 21 plant varieties in Song of Solomon, 15 animal species, and you have 116 verses, and you have all of this description of spices and ointments and plants and animals, and both accounts, Genesis 2 and Song of Solomon, are of a man and a woman loving each other in a virtual type of paradise that's described there. It's very interesting to me that, now I'll just do one other background thing, and then we'll look specifically at some things for Song of Solomon. I just want to look at the 5 books of poetry and just give you a sentence. But notice when wisdom is spoken of by God, and when God is giving people things to consider, to think about, for their minds to dwell on and to chew on, Job is going to speak of perseverance through suffering. Psalms is going to be the vocabulary that mankind can use in worshiping in song. Proverbs, as we looked at recently, practical wisdom, godliness and work close. Ecclesiastes, what is the essence of our existence? And then I believe then when you come to Song of Solomon, we have a collection of Hebrew love poetry that is going to extol the virtue of the commitment to relationship, and I'm going to go ahead and use the word covenant love, and I'll explain that as we go through. I'd like to read just some expressions in the first chapter, and I think this just kind of sets the tone, and this goes all the way through the book, but I thought these are examples because in the book of Song of Solomon, we have a verbal environment of mutual love and affection for each other. And through the years, I have talked with a few couples that spent most of their time kind of use the word bantering and kind of putting each other down. And there's a part of that that's good. But if that's the essence of the relationship, and if we're primarily poking and finding fault with each other, at some point that gets really, really old. And the tone, to me, is really important in the Song of Solomon. And we can use the word tone, we can use the word atmosphere, we can use the word environment. And when you read through the book of Song of Solomon, my beloved is going to be used 32 times. And again, only 8 chapters. And 32 times we're going to hear my beloved. 17 times we're going to hear the term my love. And this to me is very important because this sets an example of atmosphere, tone, and environment in a marriage relationship. Samples from the first chapter. Your love is better than wine. Your name is oil poured out. You whom my soul loves. O fairest among women, I compare you, my love. My beloved is to me a bag of myrrh. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms. Behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. Behold, you are beautiful, my beloved. You are truly beautiful. And I have a short quotation from a commentary that David Bland wrote. And I just thought this was a nice summary of just this atmosphere and environment that we read in the book of Song of Solomon. Here is poetry intended to evoke a mood in which love is celebrated in the appropriate context. This is poetry that creates an atmosphere of mutual respect, intimacy, and exclusiveness. Just not too long ago, I lost the last of my father's siblings. Her name is Aunt Faye. And I was visiting with her one day, and she said, one of the blessings of my heritage is that I never heard my father say, either to her or about her, a bad word about my mother. And then you have to stop and think. These two people lived through the Depression. They ran a country store from 1924 to 1942. And if you ever saw the Waltons, if you took Ma and Paul Walton and you put them in the country store, this was my grandparents, and they just lived through all kinds of difficulty. But Aunt Faye, she said, I never heard my dad say a harsh word about my mother. And then she paused and smiled. She said, he did hum sometimes, but he never said anything about my mother. And she said, my mother wasn't always the easiest person to live with. Now, what am I trying to say? The respect with which we treat one another has a lot to do, first of all, I believe, with how we believe we have been loved and cared for by God. And when I talk about parents and grandparents, the same thing with my grandfather. He always just treated us with absolute respect, and most of the time called us sir, which is kind of unusual for a grandfather to speak to a grandson with the word sir. And I think one of the abiding values of the Book of Song of Solomon is encouraging this atmosphere and environment of love and concern for each other. A second thing that I find very interesting is that the woman speaks twice as often in the book about her beloved as he does. And I know some people would say, well, that's kind of normal. But in a lot of relationships, the woman may not say as much directly either to or about her husband. You can just take that at face value, however you want to take that. But if you will look in chapter 2, 1 through 7, and then verses 8 through 17, and then in chapter 5, verse 10, down through chapter 6, verse 3, and then chapter 7, verse 10 through 8 and 4, and the woman is just going to have very specific, and I'm going to use the term, verbal admiration for her love, and the male speaker is going to reciprocate. And this is what I think is helpful, is that there are some families that you may have felt these things, but there wasn't a way to say that, or it wasn't allowed to say. And it's just interesting that when you look at the comments that are made in the book, over the half the comments are going to be made by the woman to and toward her love. When you read through the Book of Song of Solomon, and this is one of the things that has probably put some people off as much as anything else, the poems are physically explicit about the human body, but the descriptions are given in poetical descriptions that are meaningful to the speakers. And as I said, the word like is used 33 times, and just English poetry. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose. And this is a term that, again, gives us this ability to say something in a poetical way. Now, I'm going to read these word for word so I'm not misunderstood and I don't get confused here. I doubt that most women in Western society today would get too excited about being told that their hair is like a flock of goats, her teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes, or her neck is like the Tower of David. Ladies, wouldn't the following compliment just get your heart racing? I compare you, my love, to a mare of Pharaoh's chariots. Now, what I find interesting, though, having made those comments, is that these things would not be the way we would express them today. And every culture and virtually every generation has different and specific ways to express their love, their admiration. But what we need to see is that in their day, these would have been very powerful images, and they all are things that are physical descriptions which accent his admiration for her person and specifically her body and their relationship. And what you find is that this is imagery, that allows them to express very deep feelings of love and devotion, and yet it is not overly sensual, it is not obscene. The words are poetically imaginative without being unduly explicit. And I think this is the abiding value of just poetry in general, but specifically Song of Solomon. You read through these and then you get filled with this atmosphere of my beloved, like, as, and all of these beautiful symbols and parts of poetry are there to express and describe the love that they share in this relationship. What is also interesting in this book, and this is kind of the fourth thing we've looked at, is that they're kind of disjointed, and it's not like a narrative that starts and tells a story. But what we do have in this book is that there is this ever-changing circumstances of life. And a lot of times, I have sat at the front of the auditorium, and here comes the bride or something starts, and she starts walking down the aisle. And I think of two or three things sometimes. One, I have thought, if she saw the stack of dishes she's going to wash living with this man, she would run out the back door and run for her life right now. Second thing I have thought of is that I wonder how many weddings and funerals this couple will go to. I wonder how many things in life they will share. And then if by the grace of God they have their 50th wedding anniversary, they're not going to look anything like they look today. And isn't that a part of a long-term commitment, is that it's not just being in love with love, and it's not just being in love with someone who's, and let's say in their 20s or 30s, whatever it may be, talking about younger people, but it's a commitment to one person for life. And these images are also very, very important. Another thing that's happened sometimes is that the hair stands on the back of my neck because I hear Jesus say, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be when I return. They were marrying and giving into marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark. Bless her heart, there's going to be some poor girl walking down the aisle when Jesus comes back. They were in the process of marrying and giving into marriage. And so in this book, we see this reality of life, that there's this sense of coming and going. There's times that they come together, there's a separation. Oh, she asked the daughters of Jerusalem, where is my love, where is my beloved? And you have this coming and going of life, and then the joy of reconciliation. And the changes and the transitions of life are dealt with and even overcome by the unchangeable devotion and longing to be together. I want to look specifically, and if you have your Old Testament, I want us to read two verses in chapter 8. And these two verses have become very, very significant to me because when you look at, again, the tone and the atmosphere of the book, it's obvious if you know anything about God and anything about the Old Testament, it would not be a book that's promoting promiscuity. It would not be a book that's promoting casual sex. And when you come to chapter 8 in verse 6, this is the times that I have done this in a wedding. These are the verses that I've spent the most time on. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is, and here it comes, strong as death. Cruelty, jealousy, is as cruel as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, it would be utterly scorned. And when you look at this terminology, the seal was very significant in terms of both, if we send a letter that's sealed, both in terms of authenticity, both in terms of this came for this particular person. And notice the two things that are asked to be a seal and she's going to say, set me as a seal, first of all, upon your heart. And when we make a commitment to our spouse, protecting and guarding our heart in our love with that spouse is maybe one of the most important things we can do. And the second one is, set me as a seal upon your arm. And a lot of times we'll see people who are in love, a lot of talking, a lot of chattering. And what do we hear in our culture? I love you with all of my heart. Oh, she broke my heart. And here's this term, I think, of commitment, exclusiveness. Set me as a seal, first of all, upon your heart. And we've seen love expressed by people having their arms around each other as a seal around your arms. And the other part in verse 7, many waters cannot quench love, and neither can floods drown it. And to me, this is one of those very significant passages that were given in this book. So I want to do a couple of summaries, and a part of what I've done today and what we're going to look at just for a second, I use the term to say that we have some things that are intertextual. We oftentimes look at context, but as I've mentioned, and we've already kind of introduced this, but I want you to notice this. When you look at the beginning and hear Song of Solomon in the middle, and then you look at the end of our Old Testament, notice what God says about his eternal plan for marriage. We've read from Genesis 2, let's make man in our image, end of chapter 1. It's not good that man would be alone. And then here are these terms, leave, cleave to his wife, and the two become one. In the book of Proverbs that we've been reading, the admonitions are so often given to the young man that he would be saved from the loose woman, with the adventurous with her smooth words, and here's someone who's not faithful to covenant. And notice chapter 2 and verse 17. I think this is just such an important verse. The description is, she forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. And here she is out on the streets soliciting, and what is said about her, she forgets the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. When you look in Proverbs chapter 5, and I don't remember the exact verses, 13 through 12 through 18 somewhere, here's a section that some people feel like Song of Solomon is a commentary about. Poetical language, but wisdom says to the young man, drink water from your own well, from your own cistern. And here is this, again, commitment and call to be faithful to covenant and steadfast love. 5:18 of Proverbs, let your fountain be blessed, rejoice in the wife of your youth, let her affection fill you at all times with delight, and be infatuated always with her love. And then here's this expression in Malachi. And in 2016, I was able to do some marriage things in Australia. And in reading through that, something just jumped out at me. You come to the last in our section, the last book of the Old Testament, and listen to what God says. The Lord was witness to the covenant between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, even though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. And just before our Old Testament closes, especially in chronology, then God is speaking about the faithlessness of people breaking covenant. We sometimes hear the term, oh, he traded her in for a younger model, that type of thing. And God's very specific. It's a covenant. Marriage is a covenant between you and the wife of your youth, and God is witness to this covenant. So when we look at the books of history, they tell us what God's people did. When we look at the books of poetry, they tell us how God's people felt. And one of the things that we hear over and over is she is going to say, yes, my beloved. But notice this, she refers to him and she says, you are whom my soul loves. And here's kind of a complete package. A lot is said about physical things. a lot said about their relationship and their love, but it's also he whom we love. One of the things that Satan tries to do is to take things that are holy and good and pervert them. And we can talk about pornography in this category. We can talk about, and I don't know quite how to say this, there are, a man can be unfaithful to his wife physically. He also can be unfaithful to her emotionally. And I listened to a marriage counselor say a few years ago, he had counseled 600 couples who there had been an affair, and he said all but 4 of them had began emotionally, that people had begun to talk, and whether it was at work or in another context, and eventually the emotions led to the actual physical break in their relationship. And it's very important that we realize that Satan is always trying to twist that. Why would you read Song of Solomon at Passover? I don't know. One of the things that I wonder is that one of the enemies of true religion and relationship is just routine and taking things for granted and not being what I would call committed in heart. And what is true of worship, which would be happening at the Passover, is also true in our marriages. And there is a call to create an atmosphere in the book of Song of Solomon where we have an atmosphere of love and commitment and devotion that is very, very significant. When we moved to Eastside, there was a couple, and they lived over here, I think, off Hefner. And Ida Staley had a stroke, and she's bedfast. She can't talk. They can have no relationships. And for 12 years, Foy Staley took care of his wife who was bedfast. Ladies, you want to think about something kind of scary. Can you imagine what you're going to look like 12 years if your husband is in charge of all of your personal hygiene? I mean, it's kind of frightening. You can't get out of bed. You're there. He worked through the night, sweeping parking lots in grocery stores and stuff. His son stayed there so he could be with her through the day, and he took care of her hand and foot for 12 years. Our daughter Heather was a sophomore in high school, and I said, Heather, I want to take you to see something that's very, very significant. I want you to go with me to meet Foy and Ida Staley. And I said, I need to tell you, it's an old trailer house. Things are not very pretty on the outside. But when you get inside and you listen to Foy, you will think you're about to meet Miss Oklahoma. And so we knocked on the door, and Foy, is this a good time? Yes, this is a good time. Can we see Ida? And from the front door of the trailer house, he starts hollering, Ida, Ida, we have company. People have come to see us. And bless her heart, okay, she's had a stroke, and this is 12 years later. And she's just laying there holding herself, and she can't communicate, and she can't talk. And he touches her forehead and does her hair and just carries on. Isn't she beautiful? And she's so wonderful. And, you know, here's Heather, and she's a sophomore in high school, and I'd given her a little bit of warning, but she was absolutely in a state of shock. And like I told her, I said, you're going to think you're going to meet Miss Oklahoma because the way he talks to her, the way he takes care of her, the way he looks after her. And if she needs something, Foy goes without. I said, he's lost weight through these years, and he's always taken care of her. As we talked, Heather said, do you have any communication with Ida? And he says, well, if I feed her something she doesn't like, she spits it on me. And then he kind of went like this, and think about this, the only communication that they had for 12 years was that if he fed her something she didn't like, he spit it on her. And Heather said under her breath, I would have a list by her bed. Because, isn't that sad? The only communication that they had, she couldn't talk, she was bedfast, and for 12 years, he treated her like she was Miss Oklahoma. And as we left, I told Heather, I said, this is what love is. It's not the package on the outside, and it's not just the emotion, and it's not just the feeling. And Foy asked me finally to do her funeral, and literally when she died, it wasn't long before we buried him, because he had just loved her and cared for her so long. And I asked him one day, I said, Foy, you're one of our heroes. How on earth did you take care of someone for 12 years and have such a good attitude about doing that? And he just shrugged a little bit and he said, well, when I said for better or for worse, that's what I meant. And that's what I think of when I read this passage that says, set me as a seal upon your heart and as a seal upon your arm. For love is as strong as death, and jealousy is as cruel as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, it would be utterly scorned. And I have read this and I thought, is there anything that's more appropriate in today's society than for us who have entered into that covenant relationship that God is witness to try the rest of our life to fulfill that agreement? And those terms, my beloved and my love, are the atmosphere of this book, and by the grace of God can be the atmosphere in our marriages as well. God bless.